I would like to welcome everyone to today's MRA webinar titled Data-Driven Decisions, How to Overcome Analysis, Paralysis, and Create Trends Instead of Reacting to them. Before I introduce today's presenters, there are a few housekeeping items I would like to mention. This call is being recorded. All participants are defaulted to the listen-only mode so that your background noise cannot be heard. Today's webinar is scheduled to last for 60 minutes. If you are PRC certified, credit for this webinar will automatically be applied to your permanent record in the topic area of research. If you are participating in today's webinar as a group, please have the registered attendee list sent to me to receive PRC credit. Please submit questions via the question and answer screen at any time. There will be an official Q&A session held at the end of today's presentation. We will try our best to get to everyone's questions. Questions are answered on a first-come, first-served basis. To ask questions, please type your comment into the questions panel on the toolbar. Your questions will be managed throughout the presentation and answered by the presenters. All registered attendees should have received a copy of today's slides via email. The recording of today's webinar will be posted on MRA's Education Central site within the next 5 to 10 business days. If you have audio problems or technical issues during this program, please dial customer service at 1-800-263-6317. Today's presenters are Jacob Jasperson and Remington Tonar, owners of Cultural Concepts, Inc. Jacob Jasperson holds his undergraduate and graduate degrees from Marquette University, where he studied marketing and economics. His graduate studies focus on the application of economic theory and empirics to the practice of marketing research in traditional marketing models and macroeconomic models, deriving decisions based on both accounting profit and economic profit. He has years of experience applying his academic work in marketing research at a publicly traded mid-cap company and has worked in a variety of other fields, including advertising, real estate, financial product sales, and business development. Remington earned his BA at Marquette University and has MA from Loyola University from Chicago, where his research focused on the role of narratives and myths in influencing human behavior. His diverse work experience includes marketing and PR for a global technology company, restaurant marketing and PR, nonprofit management and communications, political communications and independent branding, digital marketing, and product consulting for dozens of companies and organizations. He is the executive director and co-founder of Solar for America, an educational nonprofit startup. I'd like to turn the presentation over to Jacob.
Well, thank you, Jennifer, and I'll actually go ahead and turn it back over to Rem, and Rem's going to walk you through what we're going to be doing this afternoon. So, Rem?
Awesome. Thanks, Jake, and thanks, Jennifer, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today and for taking time out of your day to come and listen to what we have to say here. Again, I'm Remington, and I'm with Jacob, my colleague from Culture Concepts, and we're a market research and branding consultancy that uses a cultural approach to research and brand strategy. And today we're going to be talking about our data-driven decisions, how to overcome analysis paralysis and create trends instead of reacting to them. And we'll be sharing our vision for how you can use a culturally oriented approach to research to conduct research in a way that helps you understand your consumers better so your marketing organizations can identify and create trends rather than reacting to them or measuring them retrospectively. And we'll go to the next slide here. Okay. So here's our agenda for today. We're going to talk a little bit more about what we mean when we talk about data-driven decisions and analysis paralysis. We're going to look at some of the research methods that are out there now that many of you are probably already familiar with and use on a daily basis in your own organizations. We're going to look at analysis paralysis, what it is, what causes it, how to overcome it, and why it demonstrates that what is out there now as far as traditional approaches to market research are inadequate or incomplete. And then we're going to talk a little bit about our cultural approach and how our cultural framework can help inform research to get more detailed results and help you better understand your consumers. and then we're going to talk about how that approach can help market researchers do forward-looking research that is proactive and engaged and relational rather than reactive and retrospective. And then we'll be sure to leave some time at the end to kind of wrap things up and do a little Q&A to answer any of your questions that you might have along the way. To start out with, we'll go right into the introduction. And like Jennifer has already stated, I'm Remington. I have my master's from Loyola University Chicago, where I studied how religious cultures influence behavior. And I've also studied political economy and worked in marketing and business development and public relations for a number of industries over the years. And then I will now let Jacob just introduce himself very briefly and move us on from here. Jake?
Great. Thanks, Remington. You know, as Jennifer mentioned, I have a undergraduate and graduate degree from Marquette University with a focus in applied economics and the application of various economic theories to marketing science. So some pretty riveting stuff in terms of my educational experience. But my practical business experience is, like Remington's, pretty broad, and it crosses and touches a number of different sectors. So that's what we're going to be bringing to this presentation, is that broad experience, specifically talking about data-driven decision-making. So before we get started, let's maybe define this concept of data-driven decision-making so that everybody's on the same page. When we talk about data-driven decision-making, what we're really talking about is gathering data in order to allow the data to do more than simply inform your decision. When we talk about traditional concepts of market research a little bit later, we're going to talk about a number of different tools. All of them are primarily retrospective or retroactive. They all look at past information in order to inform the decisions that we as an organization or we as a marketing department use to market our products more effectively. So when we talk about data-driven decision-making, we're talking about a model that allows us to do more than simply inform our decisions, but it allows the researcher and it allows the organization to influence behavior instead of simply reacting to it. Now, it should be noted at this point that when we talk about data-driven decision-making or proactive research, this is not some sort of magic 8-ball that's going to somehow magically tell us as a company what's going to happen 6 months down the road. If we promised to do that for you, I would think that you should rightfully be pretty skeptical about that, because anybody that can predict what's going to happen 6 months down the road probably wouldn't be telling you about it. So we're not making that claim, we're not making that promise, but what we are saying here is that we're going to help to provide you an organizational framework that can help you become better at communicating with your customers and your consumers on a more cultural level. And so that gets us down to the third bullet here, where we talk about creating a brand identity or a culture of consumers, if you will. So again, let's define what we mean here by a consumer culture so that everybody's on the same page. But when we talk about a consumer culture or a culture in general, we really mean shared beliefs, shared ideas, shared values, traditions, rituals, desires, knowledge, experiences. The totality or the aggregation of all of these things we would identify as culture. And so as that relates to the consumer, that will be the consumer culture. And really, when you think about it at its most basic level, culture is very fundamental to the way that we think as human beings. It's that sharing of all the different experiences and information that we as a human race have compiled over the years. A really good example of this, because I think examples help to cement this in everybody's mind, but a really good example of this would be language. If we think about the notion of language, language in and of itself is a cultural idea. You and I would not be able to be having this this exchange today if we did not have a meaningful communication structure in place. And the only way that that communication structure becomes meaningful is if we have the weight of these shared experiences, of these shared rituals, of these shared desires behind the communication structure. Otherwise, it's completely useless as a communication tool. So that's what we mean when we talk about creating a brand identity or a consumer cultures. And the last point that we'll make when talking about defining data-driven decision-making is very often it's executed incompletely. And so let's talk about why it's executed incompletely. And we touched on this a little bit, but reactive versus proactive. A lot of the traditional market research tools that are out there today very much focus on reactive types of decision, and it's not because people are not utilizing them correctly. They're reactive by the very nature of the fact that they look at information post-sale, or they look at information retrospectively. And so it's not the fault of researchers, or it's not the fault of these research tools that they're reactive versus proactive. That's the way they were designed. So that's part of the reason why this notion is incomplete. Another part, incomplete data. When we talk about incomplete data, the example we have is reliance on single data points versus an overall customer experience. So if I were to give you an example of let's say, sales data, if I'm analyzing sales data in order to try and decide what direction I want to take an organization or a marketing department, or what consumers I want to market to on a regular basis, if I look at sales data, that identifies for me a single point in time. Additionally, aside from the fact that it only identifies a single point in time, it provides no value past the buy, no buy decision that was made. So it's incomplete from that standpoint. The other way that it's incomplete, it does not factor into consideration all of the external variables that a customer might think about when they are making a purchase decision. Now, whether the customer thinks about these things consciously or subconsciously, really to a certain extent doesn't matter. The fact that they're taking them into consideration during the purchase period is enough for us to know that the single sales data, or the single data point from sales, is incomplete. And so even if we look at trends across multiple different points in time, so if I look at sales data across 6, 12, 24 months, we're still missing that external variable, all the external variables that the customer takes into consideration when they are making a purchase decision. So that's the second reason why we would consider this to be incomplete. And then the third reason is a term that we like to call customer misappropriation. So when we talk about customer misappropriation, really what we're talking about is the identification or the bucketing or segmenting of customers into groups that we as marketers do on a regular basis. The simple fact of the matter is customers don't self-segment. We try to segment and bucket these customers into groups in order to make our lives as marketers easier, and in order to allow us to effectively communicate to the different segments of customers. But the simple fact of the matter is that customers don't self-segment. And I'll give you a really good current example. I'm sure that many of you have heard about very recently about the Catholic Church's stance on contraceptive. So let's say, for instance, that I am a pharmaceutical company, and I sell birth control or a contraceptive device. I might identify a segment of Catholic churchgoers as a segment that I might not want to target because of their teachings on contraceptives or birth controls. However, what we've seen now is that you could be missing a fairly large window of prospective customers. There's been surveys done that show that a majority of Catholic women, in fact, do use birth control, even with the Church's opposition to it. So the only way that I, as a pharmaceutical company, can really effectively market that to other people is I need to understand why they purchase the things that they purchase, why they buy the brands that they buy, and really dive on a more deeper level into my customers from that standpoint. So we're going to get to that in a second. But first, what we're going to do is very briefly touch on what's out there now. What tools are out there now? And I know that everybody on the line here is very familiar with the usual suspects that we have out there, but we have things like segmentation analysis. So it's what we talked about before, that identification of a homogeneous grouping of people that, in theory, would respond similarly to a market stimulus, and can be in some way reached by the marketer and influenced by the marketer. When we talk about customer satisfaction, we talk about a voice of the customer program. It's that quantification of a given customer satisfaction level on a variety of different factors that in some way relate back to an overall satisfaction level. Share of wallet analysis, another pretty utilized tool in the market research tool bag. Identification of current customer spend levels on internal products and services, and then allocating that as a percentage of the entire customer's wallet. So you might be saying on the other line, so what? What's the issue with these? Well, as we discussed earlier, they're all after purchase. They're all retrospective. They're all retroactive instead of proactive. So we as a marketer are not creating that demand. We are simply responding to a demand by a customer that happened at some point in the past. So I think it's important to note here that Rem and I are not saying, dump your voice of the customer program, get rid of customer satisfaction, and there's no need to segment anymore because it's useless. We're not saying that at all. We're not saying that these methods are useless or inaccurate, but what we are suggesting is that when they're used in isolation and when they're used without a clear strategic business objective in mind, they become incomplete, or at the very least, they become less effective than they could be. So typically what happens when you have all of this retrospective data that you gather as an organization, you get a lot of data naturally. If you've got any sizable number of customers that engage in any number of transactions on a regular basis, that's a large amount of sales data and a large amount of retrospective customer information. So what this typically does is it inhibits the organization from moving forward. It inhibits the organization from making decisions, and you enter what we like to call the analysis paralysis stage. So let's talk about analysis paralysis really quickly. I'm sure everybody's very familiar with it. If at the very least you're familiar with the concept, if you haven't fallen victim or prey to analysis paralysis in the past, I know that I have. It's a common problem. But what do we mean by analysis paralysis? Basically, what we mean by analysis paralysis is it's the overanalyzing of a situation to the point that a decision is just never made. You continue to collect data and you never make a decision. And as Jennifer mentioned, and as you saw in my bio, I have a background in economics, and so the economic concepts are always near and dear to my heart. So if I were speaking as an economist, I would say that analysis paralysis is simply the state where the opportunity cost of gathering information and analyzing it outweighs the benefits of actually making a decision, because that's what we're talking about here. When we say that we're in an analysis paralysis state, we're saying that I have more benefit, or I get more utility from continuing to gather information than I would if I stopped gathering information and made a decision. I can also tell you as an economist that this is not an ideal or desired state to be in. We do not want to be in this state of analysis paralysis. So let's talk a little bit about why we might get into this state of analysis paralysis. We could be in a situation where we have an unimportant or less important project. And so the fact that we continue to gather information and not make a decision really doesn't matter all that much, because the project is not important. It's not strategic. there's no need to really move off of first here. We can continue to gather information till we're blue in the face, and it doesn't matter because it's not a important project, or it's less important than some of the other projects that we were working on. So that's one reason why we can fall victim to this. The second reason, and on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, is it's a very strategic project. It's a very important project, and the project has far-reaching implications. So we might enter a state where we have a project that we absolutely have to get right. And if we do not get this project right, it's going to have far-reaching implications on the organization and the marketing department. And so we as researchers naturally want to have all the information on hand for this type of a project. So we continue in this state of analysis paralysis, and we analyze and we analyze and we analyze, and a decision is never made. The third reason why we might fall victim to this type of analysis paralysis is it could be inexperience on the part of the researcher. And that's not to say that you and I as researchers are inexperienced in what we're doing, or we don't know what we're doing. But maybe for that particular project, it's a project that we don't have a lot of experience in, or we haven't been exposed to in the past. A good example of this might be social media. If you as a researcher have not been exposed to social media in the past, there could be a situation where if the project is not well defined on the onset, we can continue to gather information about the social media medium and how it relates to the project, and never move off a dead center. So those are a couple of common reasons why we might fall victim to analysis paralysis. The last point is a very important point. In almost all cases, and I won't say all cases, but almost all cases, analysis paralysis can be avoided prior to the beginning of the project in the first place. That's absolutely key to remember. So we'll get to that in a second, but first let's talk a little bit about some of the common causes. We talked a little bit about why we fall victim to the analysis paralysis, but here are some of the causes of analysis paralysis. The first one is one that I see over and over and over again in many organizations, and it's too often we're doing research for the sake of research. There's no clear organizational goal or business objective behind this research. And so the fact that we're doing research for research's sake, or maybe the organizational goal is to make money, or to increase sales, or to increase revenue, or obtain some sort of nominal ROI on this project. I can't tell you how many times I've been asked to do an ROI on a project that I'm working on, which is okay. We're not trying to demonize the ROI for heaven's sake. It's very important. But when that becomes your sole objective for doing research, you will be very prone to analysis paralysis because you have not clearly identified that driving organizational goal or that driving business objective, and that makes your research much less effective. And the reason for that is if you have a clear organizational goal behind the research, you clearly define the benefits. You're not going to be stuck in this state of analysis paralysis because you've identified the benefits, and so you'll enter a state where the benefits of gathering information do not exceed the benefits of making a decision because you know what those benefits are ahead of time. You've identified them. And so that's how you can really nip this analysis paralysis in the bud, is you need to identify at the onset of the project an organizational goal or business objective. Now, just a quick note before we move on. If you're struggling as an organization to find that business objective or to find that organizational goal to tie your research to, we might suggest, third point down here, almost every organization that I know and that I've talked to strives to somehow increase demand for their products. And this gets back to what we talked about earlier with creating demand or creating trends versus reacting to them. So that's just some food for thought when you're thinking about organizational goals and business objectives. So now what I want to do is I want to turn this back over to Rem, and Rem is going to kind of walk us through a little bit about what we talked about earlier and how we can apply that to our cultural framework and really engage with your customers on that cultural level. Rem?
Thanks, Jake. So what we have here is this cryptic-looking chart that we've devised to show the overall flow of our approach. And I'm just going to hone in on the research aspects of this diagram for this webinar and talk a little bit about how conducting research through a cultural lens or an ethnographic or ethnological lens can serve the overall marketing function, giving you a framework that serves the business function to overcome analysis paralysis by gathering more relevant, more useful data. So we start here on the left. I'm going to use this handy highlighter tool with this box right here. This is what we call the consumer's framework of meaning. And what we mean by that is all of the things in a person's life that makes their life fulfilling and meaningful. Think of it as a box into which we put things like important experiences, important knowledge, beliefs, memories, and all of the things we put into this box are invariably informed in different ways by the different cultures in our lives, and we can see all of these cultures intersecting with our consumers' framework of meaning. And again, recall that we define culture as the sum of beliefs, ideas, values, knowledge, experiences that are shared by a certain group of people. And the cultures that we are a part of, the cultures that are part of our lives and that we belong to, all fulfill different parts of our life and our identity. They make us who we are. They give us character. They give us goals and purposes. For example, some cultures, as examples, are kin or family culture, which is obviously one of the earliest types of cultures known to humanity, family culture, has a tremendous influence on who we are, what we believe, and what we want to do with our lives. Our social cultures, like our friend groups, also have a tremendous amount of influence on how we behave, and that includes what we buy. Even the educational culture that we grew up in has a profound effect on what we know and how we interact with information, people, knowledge, new ideas. Jake and I both went to Marquette, a great Catholic Jesuit university, and we can both attest to the influence that the emphasis that the Catholic system places on community service and one of the effects that has had on our worldview. So these types of cultures influence who we become, influence our preferences, influence our values, and really provide us with purpose and meaning and fulfillment and identity in our lives. And something important to note, brands can become cultures too, and so here we have brand X, whatever brand we want to make it, that is fulfilling part of this consumer search for meaning and identity. And so a brand, obviously, as everybody knows, is foremost an identity or character of a business or product. But the moment that relationships and shared ideas start to form around a brand, it becomes more than just a brand. It becomes a culture. And after it becomes a culture, the brand is able to be a force in the consumer's life that can influence and inform consumers' beliefs and behaviors through this cultural mechanism. In order to build this brand culture, marketers need to concentrate on understanding the cultures, including pre-existing brand cultures that already play a role in the consumer's life. And so from a research perspective, what does this mean for market research? Typically with segmentation, we concentrate on demographics. But demographics really, tell us what a consumer is, not who a consumer is. For example, a demographic would be, 30-year-old white middle-income suburbanites, whereas cultural or ethnographic data, this deeper level of understanding of who the customer is, really tells us something more about the consumer's identity. And to help demonstrate kind of how studying a brand's consumers and researching them from a cultural perspective can yield more detailed and more relevant data, I want to use the example of Abercrombie and Fitch, the clothing retailer that has become in many ways a cultural phenomenon. And I'm sure everybody here is familiar with A&F in one way or another. So if we were to look at A&F's consumers from a strictly demographic perspective, we might find them to be 15 to 25 years old. 60% of them are female, 40% of them are male. Income, maybe $10,000 to $40,000 a year. They're either suburbanite high schoolers or college students. And certainly this demographic information gives us some data that we can use to reach out to consumers. However, other methods, such as psychographic approaches to research, and I'm sure many of you here are familiar in some form with psychographic research, which is becoming increasingly popular. Give us, and these types of methods, like psychographic methods, give us an even more detailed picture of who the consumer is. So a psychographic research profile of the same Abercrombie & Fitch consumers might show them to be parentally subsidized. They might be a Republican. They might be sports fans. They watch Jersey Shore. They want to be or are in a fraternity or sorority. They like top 40 music, and they go or want to go to a Big Ten school. And of course that correlates with the demographic data. They're 15 to 25 years old, so they're still somewhat parentally subsidized. They're suburbanites, largely potentially Republicans. Young college students or high schoolers, they watch Jersey Shore. They want to go to a Big Ten school. They're in a fraternity or sorority. And so the demographics correlate with the psychographics to give us an even deeper, more particular, more specific profile of a consumer that goes beyond just demographics. It gets at behavior and a little bit of preferences and purchasing preferences. But it still fails to address the fundamental motivations behind the consumer's actions. It fails to really get at why a consumer behaves the way they do. But we believe that focusing on their cultural profile or their sociological background can give us much more salient information. So using a cultural approach to research, we might find that the same consumer is parentally subsidized in a fraternity or sorority because they're an only child. They might be Republican because their parents are small business owners in suburban America. They might watch Jersey Shore because that is what everyone at school is talking about, and yes, they want to fit in. And of course, they buy A&F because that person, that consumer, truly believes that it is representative of who they are and who they want to become. It's become part of their identity. But more than just their identity, it's also become a part of their the identity attributed to their social group or their friend group or their peer group or their clique at school. And so it's become something that's shared between individuals, which makes it a cultural paradigm. And so, A&F products in a lot of ways have become more than products and even more than lifestyles. They've become symbols. They've become symbols that help facilitate social relationships, which makes them cultural. When you get down to that level of sociology and shared ideas, shared values, shared preferences, social mechanisms, now we're really talking about cultures. And all of these cultures usually contain, some variety of myth or narrative system. They convey social benefits, and they have, various ideas or ritual patterns or beliefs or structures that kind of empower them and empower their consumers. So now all this information, when you get down to this level of culture, when you start looking at the social benefits and the shared experiences of the consumer, this is the information that can really help us understand who a consumer is, what their motivations are, and what their shared experiences and values are that really make them tick, that make them consume the way they consume. We can then take all the data points here that we've gathered, both the traditional and the ethnographic, the cultural and the psychographic, all of them, and use them to create strategies, for marketing organizations and branding organizations or even PR organizations. We can use them to create solutions that really speak to the consumer where they are on a cultural level. That doesn't speak to just their individuality, but it speaks to their shared identity with their friends and peer groups, and that's always going to be more powerful than speaking to an individual as an island. The advantage of doing this is that you tap into the values, of course, that they share with their communities and their friends and their social groups. And as the world becomes more connected, especially through social media and the internet and technology, as the world becomes more connected and more social, nothing could be more important than paying attention to where the consumer is on a cultural shared level. And so it's this type of cultural methodology that we think will ultimately allow brands to fulfill parts of consumers' social lives, enabling those brands to empower consumers by becoming a meaningful cultural ideal or force in the life of the consumer, which ultimately we believe can lead to a greater return on investment for the resources that we've invested into research, because by finding this type of data, this cultural data, this ethnographic data, we're really able to tap into the real ways that people learn and interact. And of course, marketing organizations can then use that data and that information to really create demand and look at where the trends are headed rather than simply look at information retrospectively or react to trends that are happening. And so all that being said, the key takeaway here of this chart and of this section that I've gone over is that, yes, we live in a culture of consumers, absolutely. That's kind of a truism now. We live in a culture of consumers, but today's consumers consume culture. The consumers of today are looking for relationships. They're looking for shared experiences. They're looking for cultural connections. And if market researchers can keep this in mind when they design their research processes, and if they remember to interpret the data in a way that accounts for culture and this idea of social shared experiences, they can give their marketing organizations the data they need to be proactive in building these types of relationships with their consumers, ultimately making the brand more powerful and more salient. And so now I'll turn it back over to Jake to talk a little bit about what all of this theory means for research practically and how to do this forward-looking research. Jake? Jake, do we still have it?
Yep. Thanks, Rem. So let's recap really quickly what we talked about earlier. We talked a little bit about what's out there now. We talked about what can happen to a research organization if you don't take into consideration the business objective or the driving force behind the research. We talked about analysis paralysis. And we've walked through how we can apply some of today's techniques to a cultural framework and communicate with our consumers on a more cultural basis. So now, let's take all that and talk about how do I do it? How do I, as an organization, execute and research proactively and look forward as a research organization? So how do I research proactively? There's a couple of key steps that we need to take into consideration when we talk about researching proactively. The very first one is one that Rem talked about and one that I talked about earlier, but you have to get into your customer's mindset. If we think back to the example that I gave a little bit earlier about the pharmaceutical company, it's not enough for me as that pharmaceutical company to say, okay, yeah, you've convinced me I need to market to Catholics, or I need to market to some other group. It's not enough to simply identify that group. You need to get into your consumer's mind and figure out why they buy the products that they buy, and what convinces them, more importantly, to buy your product versus somebody else. this type of discussion needs to take place at a cultural level. It can't take place at the sales level. It can't take place when we talk about just looking at sales. It needs to take place at a cultural level and have a more difficult time, or you will be not as effective creating that demand. You'll simply be reacting to it. So that type of cultural discussion involves more than just sales data or sales transaction. And that leads us to the next point, which is that transactional records are no longer sufficient. I need, as a marketing department, as a market researcher, as a company in general, I need more than just transactional records. I need to get the whole picture of the customer. Again, thinking back to that discussion we had earlier, talking about insufficient data points. The customer's culture cannot be limited to one point in time, i.e. a sales record. It requires the compilation and the aggregation of many different data points that ultimately lead to a customer's purchase decision, or vice versa. Their experiences, shared beliefs, shared ideals need to be taken into consideration when we talk about looking at customer information or demographic information. Transactional records no longer sufficient. So how do we do that? How do we get all of that supporting information? We need to communicate culturally. We need to communicate on a cultural level with our customers, and this involves a more relationally based discussion versus a simple, communication of product features or product attributes. If we think back about the traditional fab selling approach that we're all very familiar with, the features, attributes, and benefits, you need to move from features and attributes to benefits because that's ultimately what your customer cares about. Well, we would contend that you need to even move past that benefits discussion. Even the benefits discussion is no longer a sufficient discussion. The benefit to the customer is rooted fundamentally in their culture or their experiences or their perception. So simply talking about the benefit that you're going to provide to that customer, that might be the wrong conversation to have with that customer. You need to move past that benefits discussion and communicate on a cultural level. And that, again, involves talking with your consumers versus talking at them. So it's engaging in a conversation versus simply speaking at the consumer. So thinking, as we just kind of wrap up some of these points and talk a little bit more about how you communicate culturally, we really truly feel that organizations need to strive for this data-driven decision-making process. And it's not something that is going to happen overnight. It's not something that you're going to be able to turn the switch and tomorrow you're going to be able to go out and communicate culturally with your consumers. But if you think about the main companies that do this, if you think about the Apples, if you think about the Starbucks, if you think about the Googles, if you think about all of the Abercrombie and Fitch that Rem mentioned, if you think about all of these companies that have really perfected this notion of creating a culture, or creating a demand, or communicating on a cultural level with their customer, you can see how it will be very worth your while as an organization to do this. It will pay dividends. And so you can, it's, again, not something that's going to happen overnight, but it is something that you can place a strategic focus on. And if you can adjust your research goals, and this moves on to point number 2, if you can adjust your research goals to focus on specific goals or objectives, which would be something like driving demand, or creating this culture, or identifying customers with shared beliefs, shared values, then you can start to engage in this cultural communication. And the practical application of cultural communication it's going to be the result of a lot of traditional research tools. We've spent a lot of time talking about how some of these traditional research tools are inadequate or insufficient when they are used in isolation. But to get the information, there still is a lot of value from using things like traditional focus groups, traditional survey analysis. But the key thing to keep in mind is that when you're using these traditional research tools like focus groups, survey research, when you're even using some of these more underutilized tools that Rem talked about, like ethnographic studies, or the mining of social information from the massive amount of information that's out there in the social media realm, and taking that information, the important point to remember is it's all about framing the right research question. So the research question needs to be framed in the appropriate way to talk about communicating culturally with your customers, to talk about driving demand instead of reacting to it, to talk about identifying shared values, shared beliefs, customers that share your culture as an organization. So if you can frame the research question in that way, and then use the traditional research tools, use the kind of the newer research tools to get at that information, you'll go a long way in conducting this proactive research. So, and once you can do that, once you get to the point of conducting proactive research and communicating culturally with your customer, you can see that you'll start to really identify and even predict to a large extent what your customers want before they tell you what they want. So that is, I think that's kind of the thesis of what we had talked about here is it's all about framing the question, and it's all about using the right tools in order to uncover the culture of your consumers. So with that, I think we've left plenty of time for questions here. Just real quick before we start with questions, our contact information is obviously on the screen. Please feel free to reach out to both Rem and I. We'd love to hear from you. If you have questions that we couldn't necessarily get to in the time we have left over for questions, please reach out to us. We're very responsive, and we'd love to chat with you a little bit more about this cultural framework that we've developed. So I think, Jennifer, with that, we'll take some questions if you have them.
Great. Okay. So to start, can you give some specific examples of research methods that are more forward-looking?
Yeah, definitely. That's a great question. We touched on it a little bit towards the end of the presentation there, but you know, there's not going to be any one research method that I can identify or that Rem can identify as, you know, this is a forward-looking research tool. It's going to be a lot of the more traditional research tools like focus group survey analysis. There's some new research tools when you talk about social media, mining all of the social information that's out there on the web that is going to be very useful in communicating on a cultural basis with your customer. You know, traditional ethnographic studies are also going to be very useful for communicating culturally with your customer. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's all about making sure that you frame the question right, and identifying that this is something you want to pursue as an organization, is creating this culture of consumers.
I'm going to try and phrase this correctly. The way they kind of put it was a little different. During the presentation, you did diagnose the problem, but can you give more specific research methods to solve the problem?
Sure. So we talked about diagnosing the problem. We talked about you know, not having the organizational framework behind the research question. So I think that, you know, that's a specific action item that you as an organization can take away right now. Is you really need to have an organizational goal in mind. So I would say that as a marketing group and even more broadly as an organization, you need to identify strategically what are your main goals, and then what are the research functions going to be doing to support those goals? And so I think once you can frame the conversation and the discussion in that way, where you're directly identifying research projects or research functions that are going to support strategic organizational goals, you're already starting down the path of moving towards a little bit more proactive market research. So I think that's a key component. And then once you have that down, then you can really start to look at, what are going to be the best tools to get this information, to support this. And that's where you'll get, and that's going to vary from project to project. That's going to depend on what you're looking to do. It might be that a survey is more appropriate to your research than a focus group, or it might be that you want to mine some social media information. So I think that's going to be very project dependent, but it really starts with framing the question right. And I don't know if Rem, if you have anything.
Jake, I'll just add to that what we're proposing here isn't really a new solution to these problems that a lot of researchers are familiar with, but what we're proposing is a method or framework to use tools and solutions that already exist. So taking the tools and solutions that already exist and using them in a way that helps you really understand your consumer on a deeper level, so that you can then turn around and use that information to build a better relationship with your consumer. That's the kind of thing we're talking about. Using traditional models or techniques of market research, as well as some ethnographic research tools that are used in the humanities, especially sociology, and using some of these research methods that already exist and applying a framework, this cultural framework, to those solutions. And framing it means framing your questions in a certain way and interpreting the data you gather in a certain way to really come up with more useful information that can be tailored, that can be used to tailor more useful solutions. And so for us, I think it's about how you use these tools rather than what tools you're using.
Next question is very interesting and super relevant, especially in my world where ethnography is of great interest. Could you give examples of specific questions that might get at the culture of consumers? I get the method, but would love to have a more practical knowledge of framing the questions right.
Yeah, I mean, Jake, I can take that one to start off with. I think a lot of times, researchers who have not maybe done any work in ethnographics or ethnography or ethnology, would often find a lot of the sociological questions that ethnographers ask, slightly out of place or anachronistic. When in reality, some of these questions that might seem either random or off topic are really poignant and salient and important. So if you're doing a study of, say, again, Abercrombie and Fitch consumers, yes, it's important to know, what other brands they buy. Yes, it's important to know, what their income is, or if they have a job, or if their parents are subsidizing them, or what their price range for clothes, is, or in all of those sort of data points. It's important to know those things. But I think we also want to be asking, more than that. What types of activities, especially social activities, group activities, are they involved in? Get a sense of, their childhood, their history. Get a sense of, some of the other things that they value in their life, the shows they watch, and that sort of thing, because that can help researchers really segment them, but segment them not by demographics or psychographics, but by ethnographics, into a cultural framework or cultural bubble that really allows you to understand what it is that they're looking for in life. And once you understand that, then you can turn around and use that information again to create marketing campaigns and branding strategies that will speak to them, where they live and in the situation and environments they live in, rather than just speak to what they've bought in the past. Jake, I don't know if you want to add to that at all.
Yeah, I think a lot of that is dead on, Rem. I'll just add, it's going to be very difficult for us to provide you with a specific, question here or question there that we can use to talk about culture. It's going to be very situation dependent. So I'd really encourage you if you'd like to reach out to us, and we'd be happy to have a conversation about specifically what it is, what situation you're dealing with. We'd be very happy to have that conversation with you.
Do you have any basic or generic modifications to this approach when applying to a B2B client?
That's a great question.
That's an excellent question.
I'm glad that somebody asked that. That's a very good question. I think from our standpoint, obviously what we're talking about here can be perceived as simply B2C because you're talking about consumers. But what we've found actually in practice is that in many cases it works just as well, if not better, in a B2B setting, because even in a B2B setting, when you're selling business to business, you still have that perception issue. You still have reasons behind purchases that aren't entirely to do with price, right? Because if you think about it, if B2B selling was always just about price, there'd be no need for salespeople. We'd get rid of all of our salespeople and simply have an online catalog. So I think there are still these components at play. I think that the process and the framework is not really all that different. The only thing that might be a little bit different is when we're starting out with a B2B company. We're going to obviously frame the question a little bit different for communicating with your customers, because the company that's doing the selling to the other business is going to need to communicate a little bit differently than you would to a consumer.
Yeah, and Jake, if I can just, that's an excellent point. If I can add to that, Jake and I have both worked in B2B environments, and as a more specific example, if you're a B2B company that sells very expensive high-end technology to a Fortune 500 companies, that's really not necessary for these companies to do their business, but is kind of a luxury for some of these more successful multi-billion-dollar companies to have. If that's the kind of B2B scenario that you're working in, and I've worked in similar scenarios, one of the things you can do culturally is to really look at what types of persona that the companies you're selling to like to convey. There are some companies out there that like to show their competitors and their partners and their clients that they are successful enough to have all the gizmos and gadgets, all the newest technology, and so branding your if you figure that out and branding your technology to really speak to that attitude of conspicuous consumption, or especially maybe in the green or environmentally friendly sustainability space, to really speak to the idea that yes, this may be a B2B product, but businesses, just like people, want to be seen. They want to, businesses are made up of people, and people like to, have things in their business that allow them to kind of have that prestige, and that sense of luxury that just like people. So if you can really build that conspicuous consumption, at least with the example that I've given, I think that's a way to really attack this cultural approach, or use this cultural approach to attack a B2B scenario by really understanding what it is that your business as a business culture is after.
Okay, well, it looks like we're coming up on 2 o'clock, so thank you, Jacob and Remington, for all your information. Your email is on the bottom of that last slide, so they can email. There was a couple people that were going to email you directly with questions. But I'd like to thank everyone for attending today, and I'd like to thank Jacob and Remy for their presentation.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jennifer, and thanks everybody for joining us today.
Thank you.